Okay, so my goal for today is to talk about the development of attention in terms of developmental cascades. And my theoretical perspective has evolved over a long period of time, and it reflects many different influences. So one thing I always tell early career people and students is one of the things I love about this career is that we are always learning, and that thing that nothing is static, that there are lots of opportunities to learn and to consider new perspectives. And although there are consistent themes in my work, sometimes I'm shocked when I go back to things I wrote in the early 90s to see just how there are these consistent themes. There have My thinking has definitely been shaped by the work and thinking of others. So just a little bit of historical context. I was trained in the 1980s in a firm information processing theoretical perspective. Um, uh, this was a very strong foundation for my work. It helped me think about how individual processes are connected within a whole system, and to focus on the role of processing and processing environmental input, and how that influences development. It also was a time when that connectionism was really being talked about, and that had a big influence in my early thinking. Um, but then early in my career, I was very fortunate to have as a colleague Jody Plummert at the University of Iowa. We were two young assistant professors together, and we had come from very different theoretical backgrounds. So Jody helped me think about the work of Eleanor Gibson and of Vygotsky, and forced me to think more systematically about the role of the context and the whole child in development. And at the University of Iowa, in part because we had several people hired several people who have been trained in Indiana. We really, the group embraced dynamic systems, and that sort of also played an important role. So what I'm going to talk about today, you probably can. How infants look, then I'll shift to how infants look to learn. As I talk about each of these ideas, I will present findings from my lab, but the focus here is not on the specific set of results or findings, but more high-level view of what happens as infants learn to look and look to learn. Okay, so part one, learning to look, the development of visual attention in infancy. So this has been something that's been studied for a very long time. That sometimes at this point in the talk, I talk about a revolution that happened in the field in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when fans discovered that we could record where infants are looking. And in the decades since, there has been a lot of research aimed at answering the question of how infants' attention develops. And the conclusion has been that there is a shift from that visual, as we know from adult work, that visual attention is related to cortical and subcortical processes, and that developmentally there has been a discussion that early in infancy, visual attention is controlled by subcortical processes, and development shifts to being more cortically controlled. Okay. And there is a large body of work that has supported this kind of a conclusion, and that there was for many, many decades, this was the focus. And in fact, I have a lot of research that sort of tries to answer that question. So in one study that we did with my former postdoc, Mi Kyung Kwan, We did a study that was a quote unquote visual search task. It was a visual search task in that we showed babies an array of images, and we recorded where they looked. It was not a visual search task in the adult sense of a visual search task because we did not give infants instructions. But we thought when we showed this array, we thought it was going to be very obvious what the task was about. And the task is about trying to find the face, right? Because babies like faces. And so we thought this would be obvious to babies that their goal was to search this array to find the face. We did a couple of studies with 4, 6, and 8-month-old infants. Our first study had all 3 ages. We did a replication with 4-month-olds because we couldn't believe what we saw, and we needed to make sure that it was what it was, we could get it again. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to show you a gaze replay from a couple of infants, a young infant and an older infant. And you're going to see this is on our very old eye tracker, like 3 eye trackers ago. So there's a big crosshair that moves around the screen, and the center of the crosshair tells you where the infant is looking. So we start with a 4-month-old infant. And so we have a fixation cross, and the 4-month-old looks at the flower, the car, the flower, the car. Teddy bear looks at the teddy bear. The car looks away. Now here's an 8-month-old infant. Looks at the face. Look back at the center, looks at the face. So we cut back to the face and then reads our little thank you. What we found, I don't even have to show you the data because those, of course, were the representative of all the babies in the study. But what I'm going to show you are the results. The y-axis is the proportion of first looks. So across all of the trials that the infant completed, what was the proportion of first looks that the babies made to the face? There's a little line here that's chance. It'll get bigger when I reveal the data. There are 6 items on the screen, and so this is if they're just randomly picking one item on each trial, their performance should be at chance. Anything that's above chance means that the baby looked at that face first more than we would expect by chance. And this is what we found. We found that those 6-month-olds and 8-month-olds they got it. They knew what they were supposed to do. And they looked first at the face. Whereas these 4-month-olds in our first study and in our replication study were at chance, that they did not look at the face any more than was expected by chance. And at first, this looks like they're just randomly selecting an item on in the arrays. But we ran these stimuli through St. Lindsey toolboxes, and we discovered that the face was never the most salient item in the array. Oftentimes it was the flower that was the most salient. You can see it is sort of a brighter color, and it just by a fluky chance, we created arrays that where something other than the face was the most salient item. So we analyzed our data. This time, instead of looking, so older infants looked first to the face, but this time, instead of looking at the proportion of first looks that were to the face, we looked at the proportion of first looks that was to the most salient item in the array. And what we found was that that's what the 4-month-olds were doing. They were not random. They just had a different thing that was driving their attention, that they were being pulled to the more physically salient thing. So just as people had talked about for decades, the younger infants were being drawn by lower level stimulus properties, and the older infants were somehow being driven more by the meaningfulness or the social significance of the stimuli. And that meant that is consistent with this idea of a move to more cortically controlled visual attention. Okay, so these arrays are these very artificial, unlike anything that babies see in their everyday life. And we have moved to looking at more naturalistic arrays. These are still not exactly the way the infant sees the world, but at least they are cluttered in the way that the visual world is cluttered. And it represents a sort of richer, more and stimulus that where there are many, many more things that are drawing infants' attention. And we've done this across several different studies with many, many people who are currently in my lab. And here now, this is with a different eye tracker. So now the infant's fixation is this little orange dot. And what you can see is when infants are looking at these arrays, there are these images they're looking again is not random, right? It seems to be very systematic. They're looking at the objects and they're and so we are able to determine what is the role of different kinds of information and how infants are scanning these objects or these stimuli. And what we found, just like with the simpler visual search arrays, is that the influence of salience decreases across the first year, and the influence of the kinds of features that we think are more controlled by higher layers of the visual cortex start to have a stronger influence on where infants look over the first year. So this is even in my own lab, a well-supported kind of way of thinking about visual attention, that you have this role of changes in cortical visual areas, and absolutely no doubt that that is influencing what is going on. But that's not the only thing that's going on. And I really want to think about how even learning to look is something that is happening in a more sort of a complex developmental cascade. So just to pivot a little bit, David Rakison and I, it took us 11 years to write this lovely book, and we really thought a lot about how development, even in these narrow areas that he and I have studied, but thinking about how the development of these things is really happening in the context of the development of the whole child. And that many things are happening all at the same time that are influencing the developmental trajectory of any given thing. So, you start development somewhere up here, you go down a pathway, you hit a rock that sends you off in one direction, you hit a leaf, it sets you off in another direction, and you end up down in this pool. And everybody's ending up in the same pool. Sometimes you're taking different paths and ending up close together. Sometimes different paths send you farther apart in that pool. But everybody is sort of going through the same processes, being influenced by many of the same things. It's just those influences are varying. I really came to this way of thinking about things when I first moved from Iowa to UC Davis, and there were many people here who were interested in autism and what early signs of autism and what was happening, especially in infancy, with children who later received a diagnosis of autism. And Annette Karmeloff-Smith came here and was talking about various things. And there has been a discussion of developmental cascades, often in the context of atypical outcomes of becoming how something that happened in preschool led to conduct disorder later on. And in autism, the other thing that happened when we first got here is my son was in preschool and he had a friend who didn't have an autism diagnosis but was on the spectrum, and he was being worked with by a therapist. And the mom of this other child told me that there were two things they were working on with this child. One was the child should look at people's faces, and the other was if he was asked a question, he should give an answer. And this made me have sort of there was a light bulb moment for me about how if you're a little kid who's not looking at people's faces, then your brain is getting different input and is developing differently. And that was very helpful for me in terms of thinking about these developmental cascades, that these early event that the autistic characteristics that you see when a child is 8, 9, or 10 might have cascaded from not looking at people's faces as a child. And this young man is now an adult and does not have a diagnosis anymore. I mean, and so clearly it doesn't mean that whatever was going on with his brain isn't still there, but that the trajectory of his development got changed through this early intervention. Okay, so that also made me think that instead of thinking about the cascades happening over a long period of time, we can think about them as happening over days and weeks and months, that lots of things are happening, even very in the short periods of time that can influence that cascade. So newborn babies, even though they have poor visual acuity, they are looking at the world, and that looking at the world is having an influence on the development of their vision, right? So we know from individuals who are born with dense central cataracts that even when their cataracts are replaced and their vision is restored pretty early in infancy, they still have visual differences throughout their life, that seeing the world through that newborn, poor acuity, dull colors, fog, actually was important input for the development of the visual system. And as I said, it's not just that the visual system is developing itself, but other things are happening, that this is happening in the context of the whole child, that the child is getting motor milestones that are changing their view of the world and the way they're interacting with the world. The child is developing social interactions, and those social interactions are having an impact on their visual experience and the way they're interpreting their visual experience, and much, much more. So when we talk about a cascade, we're talking about change that are happening across multiple domains, where things that are happening at one point of time are influencing or having an impact on things that are happening at other points in time, maybe across domains. And that when something happens like pulling to a standing position, this is setting the stage for other developmental changes. Okay, so in terms of learning to look, we can talk. I'm going to illustrate a developmental cascade here in cartoon form. Do not adjust your screen. Those images are blurry. The idea is that those are the kinds of things that the newborn, in this case, little newborn Carter. I always have to put pictures of my own children in a talk just to sort of, it gives you those, good feelings in the middle of a talk. And now they are adults and look nothing like this anymore. So anyway, so this is a newborn infant seeing things that are being sort of thrust in his face in their blurry sort of way. Over the next 5 months, lots of things are happening. The Carter is getting head, neck, and trunk control, doing some assisted sitting that's giving him a different view of the world, giving him more control over where his head is pointed. He's getting oculomotor control, so even the control over where his eyes are going is changing. His visual acuity is changing, right? Lots of things are happening so that his visual world is changing. And still quite limited. So limited visual short-term memory and other sort of limitations in his cognitive abilities, but huge changes in those first 5 months. Those changes are leading to other sorts of changes. So he's starting to cruise. He's got longer memory. He's developed binocular vision, can do figure ground segregation, and is starting to have even more frontal control over his visual attention. So what we see here is that this, what he is seeing and paying attention to and how clear it is are a function of not just one thing, but are a function of multiple things all happening at the same time. And we know that this is not just a thought experiment because Linda Smith and others have taken lots of pictures from infants' foreheads, like I showed you at the beginning, and have shown that what comes into view or what is in infants' field of view changes radically over this time period. And so their views of the world, the viewpoint they have, the sort of number of faces, how objects are centered, all kinds of things like that are undergoing many, many changes, and that those are related to exactly the kinds of things that I have depicted in this cascade. So this is a framework or a way I like to think more about how visual attention is developing, that instead of just the cortical and subcortical processes influencing visual attention, but thinking about it in terms of this more system where lots of things are influencing lots of other things, and an important part of this is experience. That instead of just thinking about, oh, is it cortical development, thinking about, well, what other things, how might experience influence how infants visual attention. And part of the idea here is that as infants are looking around the world, they're using that system that is developing. So that's the practice that they're getting. That's this is them trying things out. And so as they are using that attention to look at the people, animals, objects, things in their world, that is the practice that is causing or facilitating the development. So here is Carter's developmental cascade. Here's a different Carter's developmental cascade. Let's assume these two babies are in the same community. They have the same, very similar ethnic, racial, socioeconomic backgrounds. The way I've depicted them here, the one difference between these two cascades is that infant 1 has a cat at home, and infant 2 doesn't have exposure to any animals at home. And the question that we asked in several different studies was, does having that animal in your home, so you as an infant, especially in those first few months where you're spending a lot of time at home and not necessarily a lot of time in other places, does having that animal at home shape in any way your visual attention? The idea first, and this is my other now adult child looking at our cat. So we study what we care about, I guess. So I you can see that this is a child who's very interested in cats as an infant. But the question was, does exposure influence what infants attend to? So what we did is we collected some of these data in Iowa and some of these data in Northern California. Um, and we simply asked people how do they have a pet in their home or not? And what we found was that 6-month-old infants who lived with pets, so over here is how long they looked when they saw pictures of dogs and cats, and infants with pets looked longer than infants who did not have pets. Over here is how often they were actually shown in pairs, so 2 dogs side by side or 2 cats side by side, and infants with pets looked back and forth between the 2 images more than infants who did not have pets. So telling us that exposure does contribute to what infants attend to or how interested they are in stimuli in the lab. And this was very consistent with other research showing, for example, that infants would look more at images of faces that were the same race of their parents' faces or than of faces that were of other races. So just exposure does seem to get infants to have preferences for what they will look at. But it's not just, do they look more at things? I was really interested in, does the way they deploy their attention, do the way they use these cortical and subcortical processes vary as a function of their experience? Again, this comes from the idea that when infants are looking at the cat at home, this is them practicing those processes. And so when they encounter another cat, right, you've got there's not as much of the novelty or the, like, I know how to deploy my attention to this. I see Dick at the bottom of my screen, and one time I remember he talked to me about the dazzle effect, right? When you look at something you've never seen before, it's like kind of overwhelms the system. So this is kind of the opposite of that, the idea that when you're looking at something that's more familiar or something that you're used to using your attentional system on, you're going to be able to deploy your attention in a more sophisticated way. So we did this, this was with Karina Hurley here at UC Davis. And what we did is we simply put infants in front of the eye tracker and we showed them a series of images. It's a little bit hard to see, but I'll show you the sequence in a minute. But partially, so some of the images were pictures of dogs and cats, and some of the images were faces and some were cars. And the idea, or vehicles, the idea was that faces and vehicles would be equally familiar to infants who did and did not have pets. So they had used that looking and attention process to those stimuli. There's no difference, but that when they're looking at pets, we might see differences because of their difference in experience using their attention to look at those kinds of images or stimuli. So these are 4-month-old infants. Here's one's a dog. Again, the center of the crosshair is where the infant is looking. So looking at the eyes and the mouth of the face, looking at the head of the cat, looking at the eyes. They tended to look at the wheels, but not always. Looking at the head of the dog. Okay, that was with pets. Here's a 4-month-old without pets. Oh, body, didn't quite get there. But looking at the eyes of the face. Wheels. I can't get there. Eyes of the face. So again, like I said, this is like every baby looked like this, right? No. But the babies with pets at home, everybody did eventually look at the face. This one kid is a little bit of an extreme, but we found in a couple of different studies that, oops, where is it? That infants who had pets at home spent more time looking at the heads and faces of the animals than infants who did not have pets at home. And like I said, this was not just one study. We found it in a couple different couple different ways of presenting the stimuli. And the idea is that the infant's experience looking at the dog or cat that they had at home had helped them, that gave them some practice looking at those kinds of stimuli. So when they saw a picture of a dog or a cat, they knew where to look in order to get the most useful information. Another piece of information that around the time we were doing this, there was also a computational model that of dogs and cat faces, or dog and cat stimuli that are shown to babies in these sorts of studies that were suggesting that the heads and faces were the most important regions in terms of distinguishing between individuals within the categories. So it wasn't just us assuming that the heads and the faces were most important. There was some discussion in the literature that sort of motivated us to ask that particular question. So again, it's not just pets. I'm not just interested in how infants respond when they have pets at home, but we've also done it with or shown the same thing with face experience. So in one study, we compared infants. These were all white infants, white middle-class infants with white parents. We had infants who were being raised in Grinnell, Iowa, and they had no exposure to anything but white faces. I mean, we asked the parents to report, and the parents reported literally that these babies had never seen anything but a white face. We had another sample that we tested here at UC Davis, and our infants who were white infants with white parents, they had seen lots of different kinds of faces. So we were able to compare two groups of infants who, in terms of their exposure to other race faces, it was quite different, even though they were both, their home other race was the same. We just looked at how much infants scanned these different regions of the faces. And we found that, as many people had found, that between 6 and 8 months, there was a shift in how all of the infants looked at these faces. But for the infants, we showed them white faces and Asian faces. And for the infants who were in Grinnell, they showed a difference at 8 months in how they treated the Asian and the white faces, that classic kind of other race effect that many people had shown in that sort of age range. Our Davis kids did not show a difference in how they were looking at Asian and white faces, suggesting that one possibility was that there were differences due to the difference in their exposure to faces other than white faces. Now, we didn't just do this one study. We did another study where we took children who were all within the same community, all kids from Northern California, but they had different amounts of experience with diversity. So they were all of different races. Some were white, some were Asian, some were Black, but they differed in whether they saw faces of many races or faces of just one race. So some of our kids were Black children who only saw Black faces. Some were Asian children who only saw Asian faces. And then others were children who saw the more different races. And what we did is we simply recorded how much they looked to the top versus the bottom half of dynamic. These were moving faces. And what we found was that the children who had more diversity in their face experience were looking at this is no longer an other race effect, because some of the children who had exposure to less diversity were not white or were not Asian, right? But that there were differences in terms of how the children responded based on the diversity of their experience. That children with more diverse experience visually inspected faces differently than infants with less diverse face experience. And that was basically true with both of these studies, that something about the diversity of the face experience was, it seems to have an effect, or it results in when they come into the lab, they do something different when we show them faces. It's not to say that they're like, wildly different. Some of these differences are on the smaller side. Like everybody's looking at the mouth, everybody's looking at the eyes, but it's the proportion of time they're spending at things. Having the experience of looking at more different kinds of faces seems to change the way infants look at novel faces they're shown in the lab. Okay, so what this led me to conclude was that these processes, these cortically driven processes, may be operating differently with familiar and unfamiliar stimuli. Again, the idea is that infants are practicing, and so when they see something that they are they've used those processes with before, that they can deploy them, they can use them, they can recruit them in a different way than when they're looking at something that they haven't seen or that's less familiar. Okay, so the thing is that looking is important because infants are learning from their looking. Right? That we, it's not, this is not just oh, how are infants looking? It's like, why do we care? Part of the reason we care is because this tells us what infants learn. If infants look at the mouths of faces, they're going to learn about the mouths. If they look at the heads of dogs and cats, they're going to learn about the heads of dogs and cats, right? And so infants are learning that we can sort of make some guesses about how infants are learning from those differences in their looking. And so far, we might say that infants are learning from their learning differently because of the way that they are looking differently. I'm actually going to want to take it one step further, and I'm going to say that they're learning from their looking strategies, that's going to vary also by the context, by their experience. So the first study that I want to tell you a little bit about is about the infants looking, a study that we did in as part of a nutritional intervention in Malawi, that was done by Christine Stewart and Ken Maleta. They had this big nutritional intervention. They asked Beth Prado and me to help develop a cognitive test using eye tracking. One of the things that we did was we did I see Sue Rose right there, that we did a sort of a visual recognition memory task that was based off of Sue Rose's work, where basically we did, we familiarized infants with an image of a single face, and then we paired that face with a novel face and measured their preference for the novel face. And we did this in Malawi, and we did a sample in Davis, and everything was exactly the same in the two samples. It was the same eye tracker, the same program. We made the decision to show different faces to the infants in the two locations because we wanted them to be, we did not want to get Dix-Dazzle effect. We wanted to get the something that was familiar to infants in that context. And we were afraid, especially for the children in Malawi, that if they saw any white faces, it might sort of disrupt the whole thing. The whole thing was done by local examiners. And so these children didn't see any white faces. And we similarly wanted to give our infants in Davis sort of they're more on the white side, but they're a little sort of, there's a little racial ambiguity in there as well, to sort of reflect more their experience here. So first of all, I'm just going to show you the novelty preference score. So 50% is chance. If infants are looking equally at the novel and the familiar, then they would be at 50%. Anything above 50% indicates that they preferred the novel face and presumably remembered the familiar face and could tell the difference between the two. And what we found was that in both, so California is blue, Malawi is red, both groups of infants learned the faces, both groups of infants showed significant novelty preference. They looked pretty similar. And so this tells us that infants in both communities learned and remembered the faces. So they looked at the faces and they learned the faces. Now, what was interesting was that there's an aspect of their behavior that we looked at, and that's switching. So here is, again, this is Carter as an infant. And this is what infants often do when you present them with two things side by side, is they look back and forth between the two stimuli. And then we can see how that looking back and forth is related, is related to their learning. What we found was that although the two groups of infants learned equally well, the infants in California switched back and forth faster. They made more looks back and forth per second than the infants in Malawi, suggesting that they were taking a different approach to this, that the Malawi infants, and we have other data that suggests this as well, that Malawi infants are sort of slower and more deliberate in their looking at stimuli than the California infants are. That both groups of infants were learning, but they were using their looking to learn, that they were using a different strategy for looking to learn. Okay. So this also then hints at this last piece, which is that when infants are learning about, or using these attentional processes with learning relatively familiar versus relatively unfamiliar stimuli, we may see differences. So infants do not come to the lab empty-headed, as I've already shown, that they have these experiences, and these experiences might then shape the way we learn, or the way they learn, from things like switching back and forth, right? If you're switching back and forth between two things that you're highly familiar with, you may learn differently than if you're switching back and forth between two things that you have less familiarity. So this was a study where we presented side by side during familiarization, two dogs or two cats, and then we would present infants with, in this case, an item from the familiar category and an item from a novel category, and see if infants had learned the category of dog that excludes a cat. And again, we measured their switching between the two stimuli to see whether they were doing a lot of switching or less switching as they were learning. These are all 4-month-old infants. And they are, and this slide is, well, So above the line is 50 is evidence of learning. And I've highlighted these are two different experiments with 4-month-old infants. The procedures are similar but not identical. Stimuli are similar but not identical. But basically what you see is that or what you can't see, but if I was better at if this was bigger, you would be able to see that these two groups of infants and are both infants who had pets at home and who did a lot of switching back and forth during learning. So this was in the first experiment, and this was in a second experiment. And in both of those experiments, infants who had pets at home, who did a lot of switching, they learned they learned the category. They learned that they learned that if they saw a bunch of dogs, then they saw a dog paired with a cat, that they would look longer at the cat. Interestingly, it wasn't the switching that did it. So these infants are infants who were high switchers. They did as much switching as the pet infants did, but these infants had no pets at home. So these infants did not get the advantage of doing a lot of switching in terms of learning. So whereas the infants with pets, well, they switched a lot and then they learned. Switching a lot alone did not help infants learn. If they didn't have a pet, they didn't learn. Similarly, having a pet alone did not do it. So infants who had a pet at home but were low in their switching, they did not learn. And of course, the infants who didn't have a pet and didn't switch also didn't learn. So what I conclude from this is that it's that the learning from the switching, that high switching was facilitating the learning, but only for the infants who were doing it with something that was relatively familiar, where they'd had that practice of using their looking to learn about their own cat or dog that was in the home. Okay, so like I said, this is my general thinking about how attention is happening, that it's not simply, let's think about the brain areas and how the brain areas are important, although that is an important piece of the puzzle, but we really need to think about these other things as well, and how they all are working together. A bunch of years ago, I wrote a paper where I said that we in infant cognition suffer from the Humpty Dumpty problem, where we have this like Humpty Dumpty, all the king's horses and all the king's men, right? We have all the pieces, but because we have, and I did for a long time in the good information processing tradition, studied everything in isolation, we don't have a good sense of how they all work together. But development is not, things don't happen in a vacuum, right? That the child is not just developing one thing at a time, and that the different things are influencing each other. In particular, the development is shaped by the input. And the input changes with development, that it's not just that the cortex develops in a vacuum, but there has to be some stimulation from the environment, right? And that we need to, that as you get new motor skills, as you have new experiences, as your family gets a pet, that those things are all changing what your input is. The other thing that I think is really important is that there is incredible diversity in what the input is. We've talked a lot about what is going on in the Malawi versus the Davis kids, and we cannot know. There are so many differences between them. There is a tendency to say, oh, well, those kids they're behind. They're not as well developed as the kids in the US because they're malnourished or whatever. These are actually, they're not as healthy in some ways as the Davis kids, but they are really not, they're pretty healthy. But there are so many other differences between the lives of kids in the US and the kids in Davis. Exposure to electric light, exposure to neon signs, how much time you spend outdoors versus indoors, how many different people you interact with. And it's impossible to know which of those things is contributing to this. And I would argue that they probably all are contributing to any differences that we see. So thinking about this, not just in the whole child in terms of we have motor development, emotional development, cognitive development, but thinking about the whole child as also the broader context, I think is important, even when you're doing something like early visual attention and looking. So infant development is a cascade, and that when we think about it this way, it opens us up to think about how things that are happening over here are going to influence something over here later on. And I think it gives us a much richer understanding of the whole developmental process. So here are all the people who I've had the pleasure to work with over the years. This research was funded by NIH and NSF, and actually the Malawi stuff was the Gates Foundation. And thank you all for coming. It's not early for you, it was early. I have a bunch of students here and colleagues, and they got up early to come hear me give this talk. So thank you.